The silence in the Serenity Creek Community Church was heavier than any hymn. It was a Tuesday, the one day the holy building was supposed to be empty, a sanctuary of quiet reflection. But the cleaning crew found a sermon already in progress, one delivered in a single, horrifying tableau. Pastor Aaron Hope was still in the pulpit, not standing in charismatic fervor, but seated in his high-backed oak chair, his head bowed as if in deep prayer. At first glance, it was a peaceful scene, but then the details clawed at your senses. The cruel bite of piano wire binding his wrists to the armrests, the faint acrid smell of bleach cutting through the scent of lemon polish, and the waxy, unnatural pallor of his skin. There was no blood, no visible struggle, just the profound stillness of a life extinguished. The most chilling detail, however, was on the polished floorboards just before the altar steps. A single word scrawled in a frantic, burning hand eaten into the wood by bleach. Abel. This was no random act of violence. This was a message. This was a reckoning. And it turned a house of worship into a tomb. When Detective Miles Thorne arrived, the list of suspects who would want to harm Pastor Aaron was tragically short. The man was a local saint. So when forensics lifted 2 clean sets of unidentified fingerprints from the pulpit and the piano wire, it felt like a breakthrough. But that break led directly to a wall of community disbelief. The prints belonged to Liam and Noah Croft. To suggest the Croft brothers as killers was like accusing the town's firehouse Dalmatian of arson. Liam, the older, steadier brother, and Noah, the more gregarious one, ran Croft Auto. They were the guys who fixed your car on credit when times were tough, who organized the annual toy drive, who volunteered at the church's soup kitchen. Their entire lives were a resume of reliability and kindness. Impossible, the mayor said. They were with me planning the fall festival, a church elder insisted. Their alibi wasn't just solid, it was woven into the very fabric of the town. They weren't just innocent until proven guilty. In the eyes of Serenity Creek, they were simply incapable of guilt. This created Detective Thorne's first major problem. How do you investigate pillars of the community when the whole community is their alibi? The word Abel became an obsession. It was the key. Was it a person, a code, a biblical reference? Detective Thorne's team scoured every church record, every parishioner list, every old newsletter. Nothing. The biblical Abel was the first murder victim, a brother killed by a brother. Was the killer drawing a parallel? Was Pastor Aaron the innocent Abel slain by a jealous Cain? It felt too poetic, too neat. The break came from the most modern of sources, a digital archive of the local newspaper. A junior officer, cross-referencing old headlines with the name, found it. Not Abel, but Abigail. Abigail Croft. 20 years ago, a brief, tragic article reported the death of 16-year-old Abigail Abby Croft, beloved daughter and sister, in a hit-and-run. The case was never solved. The detective's blood ran cold. Abigail's childhood nickname, according to a quote from her grieving mother, was Abel. The bleach-burned word wasn't a biblical clue. It was a name. It was an accusation. It was a 20-year-old wound screaming from the floor of the church. The killers weren't strangers. They were her brothers. And this changed everything. This wasn't a random murder. It was a long-delayed funeral for a sister named Abel. The Croft brothers weren't talking. They sat in separate interrogation rooms, a wall of calm silence built on 20 years of shared grief. Without a direct confession or an eyewitness, the case was circumstantial. The fingerprints placed them at the scene, but their defense could argue they were there for legitimate repairs. They needed the why, the motive. Detective Thorne obtained a warrant for the church office, a room filled with the weight of spiritual leadership. They searched for hours, finding sermons, budgets, and community outreach plans, the public life of a saint. It was when a junior detective, running her gloved fingers along the top of a tall, ornate bookshelf, dislodged a hidden panel that the saint's armor cracked. Tucked behind a collection of dusty hymnals was a simple leather-bound journal. It was not a church log. It was the private teenage diary of Aaron Hope. The entries started with typical adolescent angst, but then, dated just weeks after Abigail Croft's death, was the confession. A single tear-smudged page described a rainy night, a sharp impact, the terrifying decision to drive away. He wrote of the crushing guilt, the fear, and his final, selfish resolution. I can't tell. My future is gone if I do. I'll be better. I'll dedicate my life to God to make up for it. It's the only way. He had built his entire ministry, his identity as a man of God, on the corpse of a teenage girl and a devastating lie. The journal was the missing piece. It wasn't just a motive. It was the murder weapon that had been waiting 20 years to be fired. With the journal's horrifying truth in hand, the entire narrative of the Croft brothers flipped. Their charity, their community involvement, their constant presence at the church, it wasn't generosity. It was the most patient, most calculated long con in the history of Serenity Creek. Detective Thorne and his team began re-interviewing everyone, now armed with the right questions. They pieced together a chilling timeline. About a year ago, Liam Croft had joined the church's finance committee. Noah had volunteered to handle all the church's vehicle maintenance. They weren't just helping, they were embedding themselves, becoming indispensable. They needed unrestricted access, trust, and the freedom to move around the church without question. Their auto shop became the financial engine of their vengeance. The charitable donations they were so famous for were, in part, funding their own operation, paying for the untraceable poison, for the specialized tools, for the countless hours of planning. Every turkey they donated at Thanksgiving, every car they fixed for free was a brick in the wall of their impeccable reputation, a reputation so solid it would make them invisible. They weren't hiding in the shadows. They were hiding in plain sight, beloved by everyone, all while secretly sharpening the knife they would plunge into the heart of the man who killed their sister. Their kindness was a weapon, and their patience was the poison. Armed with the journal and the timeline, Detective Thorne chose his target, Noah Croft, the more emotional of the two brothers. He placed the photocopied journal entry on the cold metal table. "Read it, Noah," Thorne said quietly. "Read the words of the man who left your sister broken on the side of the road." Noah's composure, the friendly mask he'd worn for a year, shattered. His face crumpled, and for a long time, the only sound in the room was his ragged breathing. "He got to live his life," Noah finally whispered, his voice thick with tears. "He got to become a leader, a husband, a father. He got to be loved. And our Abby? She got a footnote in a newspaper and a headstone we visit every Sunday." Thorne pushed further. "The piano wire, Noah? The poison? That wasn't justice. That was torture." A strange calm settled over Noah. It wasn't torture. It was a restoration. He built his life on a lie in that church. We just dismantled it there. The wire was to make him listen, to make him hear us say her name. He had to look at us, the two brothers whose world he destroyed, and know why. He had to see that we remembered. He looked directly at Thorne, his eyes clear and terrifyingly sane. "We are not monsters. We were just the only ones willing to collect a debt that was 20 years overdue. We gave our sister a voice when the world forgot her." It wasn't a full confession, but it was enough. The why was no longer a mystery. It was a tragedy, and the brothers saw themselves not as murderers, but as grieving siblings finally balancing the scales of a justice that had failed them. The journal entry was a cold, factual account, but to understand the true horror, you had to reconstruct the night itself. Abigail Abel Croft was 16, a star on the debate team with a laugh that could quiet a crowded room. She was walking home from the library on a rain-slicked road, clutching her books to her chest. Aaron Hope, then a 17-year-old high school senior with a promising future, was driving home from a party. He was distracted, maybe by the radio, maybe by a friend in the passenger seat. His journal was never specific. He took a curve too fast. The impact was sickening. In a panic, he sped away, leaving Abel broken and alone in the ditch. The Croft family was shattered. Their home, once filled with music and debate, became a silent tomb of grief. Their father withdrew. Their mother cried herself to sleep for years. Liam, at 19, became the rock, while Noah, just 15, let his grief fester into a quiet, burning rage. They watched the police investigation go cold. They watched their sister's memory fade from the town's consciousness. And all the while, they watched Aaron Hope. They watched him graduate. They watched him go to seminary. They watched him return to Serenity Creek, a newly ordained pastor, and begin building his church. Every brick laid, every new member welcomed was a fresh insult. He was building his legacy on the foundation of their family's destruction. The new church wasn't a house of God to them. It was a monument to their sister's murder, and the pastor was a liar sanctifying his own crime. The brothers' plan was a masterpiece of cold precision, born from a year of observation. They knew Pastor Aaron had a Tuesday night ritual. He would stay late to write his Sunday sermon, often locking up the church himself. This was their window. The entire murder was choreographed like a dark ballet. Liam, the planner, had used his position on the finance committee to get a copy of the church's master key. Noah, the mechanic, had sourced the potent, untraceable cardiac toxin from a shadowy online marketplace, paid for with cash from their charity fund. On the night they entered the silent church like ghosts, they found Aaron at his pulpit, deep in his writing. They moved with a terrifying efficiency. Liam confronted him first, his voice low and steady, revealing their identity and their purpose. As the pastor stared in stunned horror, Noah came from behind, using his mechanic strength to bind Aaron's wrists to the chair with the piano wire, not just to restrain, but to symbolize silencing the hands that had prayed so hypocritically. Then came the injection, a quick clinical prick. They made him sit there in the very seat of his power, as the poison worked its way through his veins, forcing him to listen as they finally told him everything they had held inside for 2 decades. The final act was Noah taking the bleach pen and scrawling their sister's nickname onto the floor, a permanent scar on his holy ground. They left as they came, unseen, leaving the pastor to deliver his final silent sermon to an empty house. Detective Miles Thorne now held the entire ugly truth in his hands. He had the confession, the journal, the motive, and the means. The case was, by all legal definitions, closed. But as he sat in his office staring at the evidence boards, he felt a profound moral sickness. The Croft brothers were murderers. They had tortured and killed a man in cold blood. The justice system demanded they be punished to the fullest extent of the law. Yet Thorne couldn't shake the image of 16-year-old Abel Croft, or the 2 broken brothers who had been failed by that very same system. Aaron Hope had escaped justice for 2 decades, hiding behind a collar and a Bible. In a twisted way, Liam and Noah had simply delivered the sentence that life had failed to provide. He thought of his own daughter. What would he have become if her killer had not only gone free, but had become a celebrated pillar of the community, revered for his goodness? Would he have had the strength to turn the other cheek? Or would a dark part of him have understood the Crofts' terrible calculus? This case was no longer a simple puzzle to be solved. It was a philosophical battlefield. Was their act one of pure evil? Or was it a tragic, if monstrous, form of moral restitution? As he prepared the final arrest warrants, Thorne knew he would be sending 2 men to prison who, in the eyes of many, had already served a 20-year sentence of grief. He was upholding the law, but he was starting to question if he was truly serving justice. The courtroom became the new pulpit for Serenity Creek, and the entire town was its captive congregation. The trial of the state versus Liam and Noah Croft wasn't just about proving a murder. It was a public autopsy of a 20-year-old wound. The prosecution painted a picture of cold-blooded, premeditated monsters. They displayed the piano wire, the bleach pen, and detailed the meticulous planning. They played God, the district attorney thundered. They appointed themselves judge, jury, and executioner, and they tortured a man to death in his own church. But the defense did something unexpected. They put grief itself on the stand. They called the Crofts' aging mother, who spoke through tears of the vibrant daughter she lost and the hollow, haunted men her sons had become. They called former classmates of Abel, who testified to the light she extinguished in their small town. And then they called Liam. He didn't deny the acts. Instead, with a chilling calmness, he described the moment their private investigation led them to Aaron Hope's hidden journal. He spoke of reading the confession, of the surreal horror of realizing the man their community worshipped was the same boy who had left their sister to die. The law had closed the case, Liam said, his voice steady but hollow. The town had moved on. But for us, the crime never stopped. It continued every Sunday when we had to watch him preach. Our life sentence began 20 years ago. We were just making him serve his. The jury was out for less than 6 hours. The evidence was undeniable. When the foreman stood and read the verdict, guilty on all counts, a collective shuddering sigh went through the room. There was no victory in it. The families of the Croft brothers wept silently. The supporters of Pastor Aaron looked just as hollow. Justice, in its strictest legal sense, had been served, but it felt like pouring water into a bucket with a gaping hole in the bottom. The sentencing hearing was even more brutal. Noah Croft, given a chance to speak, looked directly at the judge. "You can lock us away," he said, his voice raw, "but you can't give us back our sister." You can't give us back the 20 years we spent watching her killer live a blessed life. Our punishment ended the moment he took his last breath. Whatever comes next is just geography. The judge, a stern woman with decades on the bench, seemed to age before their eyes. She sentenced them to life in prison with the possibility of parole, the maximum she could give. But as the gavel fell, her words lingered. This court deals in law, not in healing, and I fear no one in this tragedy has been healed. In the years that followed, Serenity Creek was never the same. The church, now under new leadership, saw its congregation dwindle. The stain of the scandal was too deep, the hypocrisy too profound. The Croft Auto Shop was shuttered and boarded up, a decaying monument to a family destroyed twice over. Detective Miles Thorne, who eventually retired, would sometimes visit the cemetery. He'd stand between three graves. One was Abigail Abel Croft's, now always covered in fresh flowers left by a town seeking absolution. The second was Pastor Aaron Hope's, his headstone often vandalized with the word hypocrite. The third was a new, shared plot for Liam and Noah Croft, who had both died in prison within a year of each other. Noah from an illness. Liam, it was whispered, from a broken heart. The story of the pastor. The poison and the brothers became a local legend. A dark fairy tale parents told their children to warn them of the dangers of secrets and the destructive power of vengeance. The town had peace, but it was an unquiet peace, the kind filled with unanswerable questions. They had learned that some debts can never be truly repaid, and that sometimes the pursuit of justice doesn't end the story. It just leaves everyone, guilty and innocent alike, lost in the terrible, silent echo of a crime that never should have happened. 5 years after the trial, a digital forensics expert working to archive old police evidence decided to run the Croft brothers' personal computers through a new data recovery program. What he found would reopen a wound the town had tried so hard to forget. Hidden in an encrypted partition on Liam's laptop was a second journal, his own. The entries were a meticulous record of their year-long investigation, but the final entry, dated the day after the murder, contained a bombshell. He begged. At the end, he looked at us and he begged for forgiveness. Noah said, "Like you forgave yourself for Abel?" He had no answer. But then he said something else. He said, "There's another one. A boy on a bike a year before your sister." I was scared. I didn't stop then either. The confession stopped there. The brothers had never mentioned this to the police, to their lawyers, to anyone. The revelation was staggering. Aaron Hope hadn't just killed Abigail Croft. He was a repeat offender, a serial hit-and-run driver whose path of destruction was even longer and darker than anyone knew. The Croft brothers hadn't just killed a man who murdered their sister. They had, without knowing it, eliminated a predator who would have almost certainly killed again. The new information created a moral earthquake. The DA's office, faced with this impossible situation, chose to bury it. Officially, the case was closed and nothing could undo the brothers' convictions. But unofficially, a strange and silent pact was made. The town, now fully aware of the monster they had once revered, turned its back on Aaron Hope's memory. The church quietly sold its property and relocated under a new name. Hope's grave in the town cemetery, once well-tended, became overgrown and neglected. No one would openly admit to vandalizing it, but the headstone was repeatedly defaced until the church council, in a move of quiet shame, had it removed entirely. The plot was reseeded with grass, leaving no marker, no name, nothing to indicate the man who lay beneath. He was erased. In death, the community delivered the final judgment the courts never could. He was deemed unworthy of remembrance. On the 10th anniversary of the brothers' conviction, a small, simple monument appeared in the town square. It wasn't grand or official. It was a bronze plaque on a stone bench, placed under a young, flowering dogwood tree. The inscription read, "In memory of Abigail Abel Croft, and for all silent voices that deserve to be heard." There was no mention of the murder, the trial, or the pastors. It was funded anonymously, though most suspected the money was pooled by the retired Detective Thorne and a few others who knew the whole truth. The Abel bench became a sacred space in Serenity Creek. Teenagers would sit there on their first dates. Elderly residents would rest there in the sun. Mothers would read to their children on it. It was a place of quiet contemplation, a daily living reminder of a life cut short and the catastrophic consequences of secrets. The town never truly moved on from the tragedy. Instead, they learned to carry it with them, a somber weight that made them kinder, more vigilant, and more deeply connected. The story of Abel was no longer a tale of vengeance, but a permanent lesson in the cost of truth. The bench ensured that the only legacy that would endure was not of the killer, nor of the avengers, but of the bright, lost girl whose name was finally and peacefully remembered. A decade after the monument appeared, a stranger arrived in Serenity Creek. He was an older man, well-dressed, with the weary posture of someone carrying a heavy burden. He went directly to the Abel bench and sat for a long time, his head bowed. When he finally rose, he asked a local shopkeeper for directions to the police station, where he asked to speak to the officer in charge of cold cases. He introduced himself as Robert Davies and explained that he had been the passenger in Aaron Hope's car the night Abel Croft died. For 30 years he had lived with the secret, his silence bought by his family's status and his own cowardice. Hope's death had felt like a release, but the recent news of the second victim, the boy on the bike, had shattered his fragile peace. "I enabled a monster," he confessed, his voice breaking. "I told him to drive away. I helped him hide the car. My silence let him do it again. I need to confess it all." His testimony was the final, brutal footnote to the tragedy, confirming the brothers' darkest suspicions and revealing that the circle of guilt had been wider than anyone ever knew. Robert Davies's public confession ignited a firestorm. A local journalist, digging deeper, published a sprawling feature that wove together the entire saga: Abel's death, the covered-up bicycle accident, the brothers' vengeance, the hidden journals, and now, the corroborated confession of an accomplice. The court of public opinion, once divided, now swung overwhelmingly in favor of the Croft brothers. An online petition demanding a posthumous pardon for Liam and Noah gathered hundreds of thousands of signatures in a matter of weeks. It argued that while their methods were undeniably criminal, they had acted in the face of a profound systemic failure and had, in fact, stopped a serial offender. The state governor's office was forced to issue a statement, saying they were reviewing the matter, a political minefield that pitted the rigid letter of the law against a powerful wave of public sentiment for moral justice. The governor ultimately declined to issue a pardon, stating it was a legal impossibility for the deceased. However, in an unprecedented move, he approved a formal statement of regret from the state, addressed to the memory of the Croft family, acknowledging the catastrophic and repeated failures of the justice system that contributed to this tragedy. On a bright spring day, this statement was read aloud by the current mayor at a small ceremony at the Abel bench. The event was attended by a handful of townsfolk, the now elderly Detective Thorne and Robert Davies, who stood at the back, his head bowed in permanent shame. There were no cheers, no sense of victory. It was a somber acknowledgement of a wound that could never fully heal. The story of Serenity Creek was now complete. It was a story not of good versus evil, but of the devastating gray areas in between. It taught that justice delayed is not merely justice denied, but a poison that can seep through generations, and that sometimes the only true peace comes from finally, and honestly, speaking the truth. No matter how long it has been buried, the Abel bench remained, a quiet sentinel to a painful past, ensuring the town would never again forget the cost of a silent conscience. The governor's statement of regret did not bring peace to Serenity Creek. It merely formalized the ghost that had haunted the town for 30 years. The story was now a part of the national consciousness, a true crime parable discussed on podcasts and news shows. But for the people who lived there, it was not a story. It was the air they breathed, a permanent low-humming tension between the official record and the emotional truth. The church, now rebranded as New Beginnings Fellowship, struggled to fill its pews. Every sermon about forgiveness was shadowed by the memory of Aaron Hope's hypocrisy. Every call for justice was measured against the brutal vigilante act of the Croft brothers. The town was trapped in a moral purgatory of its own making. It was the children, as it often is, who stumbled upon the next layer of the mystery. A group of teenagers, armed with a metal detector and fueled by a morbid fascination with the local legend, were searching the woods near the old, abandoned stretch of road where Abigail Croft had been killed. They weren't looking for evidence. They were looking for a thrill, a tangible connection to the ghost story they'd grown up with. The metal detector shrieked near the base of a gnarled ancient oak tree, digging with a sense of thrilling dread. Their shovels struck not a buried treasure, but a rusted sealed metal box. The the kind used for important documents. With trembling hands, they pried it open. Inside, protected from the elements, was Aaron Hope's final unsent confession. This was not the panicked scrawl of a teenager from his journal. This was the meticulous, despairing script of a man in his 30s, written on the official stationery of the Serenity Creek Community Church. It was dated just 1 month before his murder. In it, he named Robert Davies explicitly, detailing his role in the cover-up. He confessed to the hit-and-run involving the boy on the bike, providing a name, Jamie Briggs, and a location, a cold case in a neighboring county that had also gone unsolved. But the most devastating part of the letter was his plan. He wrote of his intention to dissolve the church, to liquidate all its assets, and to create 2 trusts, one for the surviving family of Jamie Briggs, and one for a scholarship in Abigail Croft's name. He was going to confess everything from the pulpit on a designated Sunday, then turn himself in to the police. "I have built my life upon a foundation of sand and blood," he wrote. "The weight of it is crushing me. I can no longer preach about light while living in this darkness. I must tear it all down, even if it destroys me. It is the only path toward any semblance of grace." The letter changed everything again. The Croft brothers had not murdered a remorseless monster. They had murdered a man on the precipice of his own redemption. They had, in their righteous fury, stolen his chance to finally do the right thing. They had killed the man Aaron Hope was about to become. The discovery sent a new, more complex shockwave through the town. The brothers were not just avengers. They were, in a tragic and irreversible way, the unwitting agents who had prevented a form of justice and healing that could have saved everyone, including themselves. The ghost of Aaron Hope was no longer just a hypocrite or a victim. He was a profoundly broken man whose path to salvation had been brutally cut short. 50 years after the death of Abigail Croft, the town of Serenity Creek had finally, truly, grown around its pain. The Abel bench was weathered and smooth, the bronze plaque worn by countless hands. The story was now a chapter in the town's official history, taught in the local high school not as a sensational crime, but as a complex study in ethics, grief, and the failure of systems. The New Beginnings Fellowship, after decades of struggle, had found a humble, genuine purpose, focusing on community outreach without the grandiosity of its predecessor. On the anniversary of Abel's death, an annual Day of Grace was held. It was not a somber memorial, but a vibrant street fair with food and music, its proceeds funding the Abigail Croft Memorial Scholarship, which had, over the years, sent dozens of young people to college. The legacy of the bright lost girl was no longer one of vengeance but of opportunity. The ghost of Aaron Hope was rarely spoken of, his name a faint, uncomfortable echo. The Croft brothers were remembered with a painful, complicated pity. On this particular anniversary, an elderly man with kind eyes and a gentle demeanor sat on the Abel bench, watching the festivities. He was a retired history teacher who had moved to Serenity Creek a decade prior. The children playing in the square knew him as Mr. David, the man who gave out the best candy on Halloween and who always had time to listen. They did not know that he was the grandson of Jamie Briggs, the boy on the bike whose death was finally acknowledged because of a murderer's unsent confession. He had been the first recipient of the scholarship funded by the dissolved assets of the old church, a twisted, poetic justice that had given him a future his grandfather never had. He watched as a little girl, no older than Abel had been, tripped and skinned her knee. Her wail cut through the music. Before her parents could reach her, 2 teenage boys, one tall and steady, the other with a more energetic grace, rushed over. The taller one knelt, his voice calm and reassuring, while the other pulled a bandage from his pocket with a flourish. They helped her up, their actions a seamless, unconscious dance of brotherhood. Mr. David smiled, a sad, knowing smile. He saw no ghosts in that moment. He saw only the living. He saw a town that had been to hell and back, that had wrestled with its demons in the open and had chosen slowly and painfully to weave its trauma into the fabric of its community, creating something stronger and more compassionate from the threads of its ruin. The vengeance was spent. The lies were ash. The justice was imperfect. But the harvest, he thought as he watched the brothers help the little girl find her parents, was finally mercifully kind. The story was over, and the town at long last was simply living again.